Hi everyone, Ken Briggs here. Just wanted to give some quick thoughts on what is unfolding with the peace process in Ukraine and in Europe generally. And there have been some interesting developments over the last couple of days that I want to cover. So, what really prompted this was complaints out of Europe over the behavior of a U.S. military official, defense official, who met with his counterparts and essentially berated them on shifting towards European defense industries and away from American defense industries. And the shift was natural in Europe because as the U.S. has withdrawn its support for Ukraine and signaled us support for NATO, it makes sense that they would try to develop these industries domestically within their countries. And that's the unintended side effect of wanting to get the United States out of Europe is that now we have less leverage in Europe. They don't really have to listen to us if we aren't guaranteeing their defense, nor should they want to. There's no incentive for them to do so, especially as the U.S. has now essentially stopped the flow of aid to Ukraine, which is the number one security concern in Europe at the moment, and has signaled at least some camaraderie or some support for the Russian position in the conflict, which is, again, the biggest security threat to Europe. So, what to make of this whole situation? There was concern internally in Ukraine after a top official was fired for corruption after this big corruption investigation. These investigations are occurring in compliance with Ukraine's European Union aspirations. There's certain requirements they have to meet as far as corruption, as far as internal reform. They've passed a political reform bill. So these aren't things that are new or some sort of secret corruption that's being uncovered in Ukraine. This is them trying to weed out what has been an endemic problem in the country and most of the post-Soviet countries since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? And no mention is made of, the oligarchs or the horrible corruption in the Russian government. So now you have this drama going back to the peace plan where the United States released this 28-point plan that appeared to be giving Russia everything it wanted. And then there was this classified briefing that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, gave to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he essentially said, "Yeah, this is a Russian plan that's didn't come from us." And then he had to backtrack and say, "No, this was our starting framework for a peace plan." Partly because his boss, the president, had already tweeted about how Ukraine needed to accept this peace deal. And so, what's in it? Well, things like limitations on foreign troops in Ukraine. Ukraine can't join NATO, and Ukraine has to limit the size of its military. So we're basically imposing limits on Ukrainian sovereignty in order to accommodate the Russians and give the Russians land that they have not been able to conquer. Because despite what people think, the state of play is Russia is advancing, but extremely slowly. And these advancements are occurring at too slow of a pace for the amount of casualties they're sustaining. Maybe Putin has a different judgment of that because he thinks this is going to wrap up in his favor soon. I don't know. But, suffering over 1 million casualties to take, 1 to 2% of Ukraine over the last 3 years now, that's not a good sustainable pace. And again, how the U.S. appears to be approaching this is that there's two sides to this. There's the United States and there's Russia, and Ukraine's kind of carved up between them, and Europe is irrelevant. And that really doesn't map onto what the actual situation is. Because Ukraine has to agree to the deal. They put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this. They've been able to stall the Russian army, which, from a conventional standpoint, obviously is not as strong as people thought going into this. And then you have all these European states that have their own security interests. Poland, especially on that border. Poland's the biggest standing army in Europe, which I've mentioned several times. So outside of Ukraine. So I'm really skeptical of this peace process because we're not approaching it with the reality of the different players and their strengths, and our model for what that is just not correct. And so, to me, I foresee this war carrying on, which is unfortunate. But until the negotiation gets put onto a more realistic path, I think that's where we sit. So, thanks for listening in, and I'll have another one of these soon.